The Trump administration has made so many harmful decisions in such a short period of time that tackling all of them will be challenging, but I'll do my best to give you an overview of some of the major things that have happened over the last month. Hello everyone, good to have you with us. You're listening to the For Climate Out Loud podcast, where we cover the latest news from the world of environmental politics. A lot has happened since our first episode, so today I'm going to give you a recap of some of the major news that broke during the month of April 2025. If you want to stay up to date with the latest developments in the world of environmental politics, make sure to follow For Climate Out Loud on social media and hit subscribe. Thank you so much for listening, and let's jump in. I want to start off with the European Union, where we're seeing two somewhat contradictory things happening at the same time. On the one hand, there's some really positive news coming out of the EU. For example, at the end of March, Germany pledged 100 billion euros for climate action and energy transition as part of a 500 billion euro infrastructure and defense fund. This is Germany's largest ever green investment package. Potential allocations for these 100 billion euros include the renewable energy sector, so wind, solar, and hydrogen infrastructure, energy efficiency upgrades, sustainable transport, strengthening and expanding Germany's electricity grid, and funding carbon storage and climate adaptation projects. This is great and exactly the sort of thing we'd like to see more of. Another piece of good news is that the European Commission announced in April that carbon dioxide emissions regulated under the EU's emission trading system fell by 5% in 2024 due to cuts in the power sector. Now, for those of you who might not be familiar with emission trading systems, these are carbon emission schemes, also known as cap and trade schemes, that aim to reduce emissions by creating a sort of market area with limited allowances for emissions. Within this area, businesses are allotted a specific amount of emission allowance, which they're then allowed to trade amongst each other, but they're not allowed collectively to exceed the overall emissions cap. The EU's emission trading system was created in 2005 and covers around 45% of the region's greenhouse gas emissions. So, according to the EU Commission, emissions within its trading system are now around, quote, 50% below 2005 levels and are on track to achieve the 2030 target of 62%, end quote. The reason for this drop, according to the Commission, is, quote, an increase in electricity production from renewables by 8% and nuclear by 5%. Coupled with a decrease in gas by 8% and coal by 15%, end quote. So, more good news. Now, on the other hand, in contrast to these positive developments, at the beginning of April, the European Union voted to pause its sustainability rules, which aim to make the region climate neutral by 2050. This in response to claims by European industry leaders that these rules put them at a disadvantage compared to China and the US, where President Trump is actively slashing regulations and imposing tariffs on foreign goods. The European Parliament and member states must now negotiate a proposal to exempt smaller businesses from sustainability reporting rules, a process that could take over a year, hence the freeze. As of now, firms with fewer than 500 employees and larger firms not deemed public interest entities won't have to report their sustainability impact until 2027, with reports due in 2028. The EU also wants to change its due diligence law to allow companies to assess their supply chains for environmental and human rights problems once every 5 years instead of once a year, which is what they're currently required to do. These steps have drawn intense criticism from some investors, left-leaning lawmakers, and climate and human rights campaigners who rightly argue that if implemented, these proposals would gut corporate accountability. By mid-April, a coalition of 7 nonprofit organizations launched a complaint with the European Ombudsman, an independent body tasked with holding the EU's institutions and agencies to account. The coalition argued that the move was A, undemocratic, given that it was made without public consultation, B, untransparent in the sense that it failed to provide any sort of evidence or impact assessment, and C, that it was rushed. While the European Ombudsman can't force the Commission to reverse course, if it were to side with this coalition of nonprofits, it would certainly put pressure on the Commission to reevaluate its position. Personally, I think that while economic factors obviously have to be taken into account, especially under current circumstances, I would agree with the argument that the decision-making process needs to be more transparent and deliberative, which would also make it more legitimate. Another point of concern regarding the EU is the Commission's consideration to loosen its goal to cut 90% of greenhouse gas emissions by 2040. Again, the reason for this are concerns about costs for heavy industry and agriculture. As reported by Politico, the options being discussed include allowing countries to defer steeper cuts, permitting them to count carbon reductions they finance in other countries, and exploring the potential of carbon removal by forests or technology, so by carbon capture. Now, I want to pause here for a moment to talk a little bit more about carbon capture. Carbon capture is the process of removing carbon dioxide from the air by capturing it at emission sources like power plants or industrial facilities, and then storing it underground or using it for other purposes. Carbon capture emerged as a technology sometime during the 1920s, but over the last decades it's become increasingly efficient and consequently has gained more and more traction among those who view it as a solution to the greenhouse gas problem. In fact, a lot of money is currently being invested in the construction of carbon capture plants around the world. Interestingly, but also not surprisingly, the biggest investors in carbon capture are fossil fuel companies, who are pushing carbon capture as a solution to the climate crisis while using it as a pretext to continue emitting. So obviously there's a problem with this solution, and that is that it's not really a solution. In an interview with CBS News, Mark Jacobson, professor of environmental engineering at Stanford University, pointed out that the amount of energy required to power carbon capture plants is so great that any benefit from this technology would be canceled out, even if one were to use renewable energy, because doing so would divert clean energy from being used elsewhere, where it could replace dirty energy. So by all means, the EU should go ahead and plant more trees, but I would urge it not to rely too heavily on carbon capture technology as a solution. Back to the news. The European Commission's consideration of loosening the 2040 climate goal obviously has a political component, and that is that EU officials want to make the legislation easier to pass. Opposition to the 90% goal has been growing, particularly in countries with right-leaning governments like Italy. Still, the majority of countries seem to support the goal, so it'll be interesting to see what happens there. The outcome of this will inform the 2035 climate plans that the EU and all other countries have to submit this year under the Paris Agreement. Unfortunately, as reported by Politico, the European Union's delay in making a decision on this issue, combined with the dismantling of environmental regulations in the US, is signaling to other major polluters that the standards are being lowered, which could lead them to slack off on their own efforts to reduce emissions. One last note on Europe, and again, not a positive one. The EU has eased reporting requirements under its anti-deforestation law, which bans imports of commodities linked to forest destruction, so things like soy, beef, cocoa, and palm oil. Companies are now allowed to submit annual due diligence statements rather than statements for each shipment, which of course weakens the effectiveness of the law. I also briefly want to mention Switzerland, which, while not part of the EU, is right smack in the middle of it, at least geographically. Here, the Swiss National Bank is facing backlash over its investment in companies that have been identified by a University College London study as environmental tipping point companies, in the sense that they cause irreversible damage to the environment. Activists outside the SNB shareholders meeting called for stricter investment criteria and urged the National Bank to use its influence to affect company behavior. Whether or not they'll do so remains to be seen. On to the rest of the world and some brighter news. Brazil, which will be hosting this year's United Nations Climate Summit, and recently launched its own landmark initiative aimed at raising up to $2 billion in financing to restore 1 million hectares of degraded land in the world's largest ever land restoration project, is set to be pushing for tougher emission goals in an effort to keep global temperatures well below 2 degrees Celsius. Go Brazil! The South American nation wants large economies like China and the European Union to be more ambitious in their emission reduction plans, which they were supposed to submit in February, but because of the aforementioned delays, will now be submitted by September. China, the world's largest emitter, has announced that it will not slow down its commitments and that its nationally determined contributions will cover all sectors of the economy and all greenhouse gases. Its current target for 2030 only covered carbon dioxide emitted by the energy sector, so this is a really important announcement. However, China has not indicated that it will increase its target, and given the trade war with the US, more ambitious goals are not a guarantee. Currently, its goal is for peaking carbon dioxide emissions before 2030 and reaching carbon neutrality by 2060. Since 2020, China has also committed to reducing carbon dioxide emissions per unit of GDP, also known as carbon intensity, by more than 65% below 2005 levels by 2030. But given the combination of slower economic growth and a rapid rise in CO2 emissions, the country is still far off track as far as meeting this intensity target is concerned. Another important April announcement from China's National Energy Administration is that in the first quarter of 2025, the country's solar and wind energy capacity exceeded for the first time that of thermal energy, which is mostly coal-powered. While still heavily reliant on coal, China has been rapidly growing its renewable energy sector over recent years, building nearly twice as much solar and wind capacity as the rest of the world combined. Taking a jab at President Trump, President Xi further called for countries to work closer together towards climate action and facilitate the free flow of green technologies. And honestly, he has a point. In fact, the OECD, in a joint report with the UN Development Program, found that setting ambitious greenhouse gas emission reduction targets and laying out the policies to achieve them would result in a net gain to total global GDP by the end of the next decade. This contradicts critics of net zero policies who argue that taking strong action to tackle the climate crisis will damage countries' finances. The net gain of 0.23% by 2040 calculated in the report would be even greater in 2050 if one takes into account the benefit of avoiding the economic costs that would result from not cutting emissions. As reported by Fiona Harvey in The Guardian, by 2050, quote, the most advanced economies would enjoy an increase of 60% in GDP per capita growth, while by the same date, lower income countries would experience a 124% rise from 2025 levels, end quote. Developing countries stand to reap the benefits of cutting emissions as well, as this would lift 175 million people out of poverty by the end of the decade. By contrast, if the climate crisis was left to run its course unchecked, a third of global GDP would be lost this century. So the message is clear. Tackling the climate crisis will spur growth. Not doing so will be costly. And on this note, let's turn to the US, where the costs will be felt very soon. The Trump administration has made so many harmful decisions in such a short period of time that tackling all of them will be challenging, but I'll do my best to give you an overview of some of the major things that have happened over the last month. Among the most consequential is the Trump administration's decision to fire hundreds of scientists who were working on the 6th National Climate Assessment, the federal government's report on climate change and its impact on the country. Since 2000, the federal government has, every few years, published a report on the effects of global warming on human health, agriculture, fisheries, water supplies, transportation, energy production, and other areas of the U.S. economy. This so that state and local governments, as well as the private sector, can prepare for the effects of climate-related events. The climate assessment is usually written by scientists and experts around the country who volunteer their time to compile the report, which is then reviewed by 14 federal agencies and submitted for public comment. The whole process is overseen by the Global Change Research Program, a federal group established by Congress in 1990 and supported by NASA. Dismissing the people who were working on this report essentially puts an end to it, even though it is mandated by Congress. Some fear that the Trump administration will try and write an entirely new report to downplay the risks of climate change, but it's still unclear exactly what they will do with it. In the same vein, the White House also moved to cut $4 million in federal funding for Princeton University's Climate Research Department, claiming that it exposes students to climate anxiety. This is part of a larger effort to pare back on roughly $220 million per year in funding from NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which, aside from being the nation's #1 climate and weather agency, had been collaborating with Princeton on improving computer models that show how the oceans and atmosphere are changing. As reported by Politico, the Trump administration wants to dismantle NOAA and, quote, end its climate work by abolishing its primary research office and forcing the agency to help boost U.S. fossil fuel production, end quote. Combined with cuts to staffing at the National Weather Service, these attacks on our ability to gather information and expand our knowledge on climate change will have major implications for the ability of state and local leaders to prepare for adverse weather events and the impacts of climate change, not to mention the needless loss of life that will likely result from these gaps in information. Let's move on to policy. Early last month, Trump issued an order to block the enforcement of city and state-led climate policies aimed at holding fossil fuel companies accountable for environmental damages. The order came in the wake of moves to revive the coal industry and followed a meeting with fossil fuel executives seeking immunity from climate litigation. Similarly, the U.S. will no longer require environmental impact statements for thousands of oil and gas leases across the western U.S. As mentioned in the first episode, fossil fuel companies poured millions of dollars into Trump's re-election campaign, so it comes as no surprise that he's now doing everything he can to remove any obstacles these companies might face in their pursuit of profits. Perhaps most immediately concerning to Americans' health is the Trump administration's decision to exempt more than 60 coal plants from federal mercury and air toxic standards. During the Biden administration, these standards were strengthened in an effort to reduce emissions of mercury and non-mercury metal pollution. This includes nickel, arsenic, and lead, which can all have significant health impacts, including heart attacks, cancer, and developmental delays in children. But the Trump administration doesn't seem too worried about these things. What Trump does worry about is that these tighter rules will be too burdensome for coal-fired plants, and so he's exempting them from these rules for a period of 2 years beyond the 2027 compliance date, so until 2029. This decision comes only a few weeks after the National Institutes of Health announced that they would end future funding to study the health effects of climate change. Another regulation to be loosened is the Endangered Species Act. The Trump administration has decided to remove the concept of habitat modification from the definition of harm. This change would reduce habitat protections for endangered species. The U.S. has also withdrawn from talks aimed at advancing decarbonization efforts in the shipping sector. As reported by Politico, the Trump administration has called the International Maritime Organization's plans to impose a carbon tax on international shipping blatantly unfair and has made it clear that, quote, the U.S. will not accept any international environmental agreement that unduly or unfairly burdens the U.S. or the interests of the American people, end quote, and that it would consider reciprocal measures should any taxes be imposed on U.S. ships. So the trend set by the Trump administration seems pretty clear. Short-term profits over long-term gains. But who gets to profit? Not the American people, that's for sure. And even those who do temporarily profit from these actions ultimately will lose because, as mentioned before, their business models are unsustainable in the long run. Climate change will eventually impact everyone and everything, so it'd be quite foolish not to take action while we still can. But I don't want to leave you on a negative note, so here's a little bit of good news as far as the US is concerned. The global trade war that Trump has unleashed, it may come with a perk, although a short-lived one. As noted by Lydia DePillis in the New York Times, as companies and consumers cut spending in response to higher prices for imported goods caused by Trump's tariffs, greenhouse gas emissions might actually slow down a tad, giving the environment a little reprieve. Like I said, a short one, but we'll take what we can get. This, my friends, is where I leave you for now. If you want to know more, hit those like and subscribe buttons and follow For Climate Out Loud on social media. I'm Laura McLeod, and it's been my pleasure to bring you the news from the world of environmental politics. Thanks for listening in. Until next time.